I'm Dr. Alan Rutberg. I'm director of the Center for Animals and Public Policy. And this is the first of our Animal Matters public seminars for the year. The Animal Matters seminars are sponsored in part by the Elizabeth A. Lawrence Fund, which enables us to bring all kinds of people in. We're going to have a very nice series this fall. They're mostly scheduled already, and Ginny will circulate the information once we have a final schedule. But the next scheduled talk will be on Friday, September 8th, so about a week and a half from now, which will be Dr. Andrew Rowan, who is currently the CEO of Humane Society International. He is also one of the co-founders of the center and the founder of the Master's Program in Animals and Public Policy back in 1995. So he'll be talking to us about global the management of populations of feral dogs, free-roaming street dogs around the world, and the feasibility of controlling their populations. So that will be, again, Friday, September 8th. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Emily McCobb, who's the Assistant Director of the Center and the Director of the Shelter Medicine Program, to introduce our speaker for today.
Thank you guys very much for coming. It's a great pleasure to get to introduce our speaker, Amanda Arrington. She's one of my personal heroes, and the first time I heard her speak definitely changed my life. So it's been a goal for me since then to get her to speak to you guys. So I'm really excited that she could come. And she didn't come by herself. She brought a whole slew of colleagues. So as most of you guys know, we've been working on accessible care programs here at the school and just gaining a better understanding of how we can better serve all the animals in our community and how we define what our community even includes. So I'm just going to give you her bio. She's currently the director of the Pets for Life program, which is an initiative of the Humane Society of the United States. And prior to that, she was the North Carolina state director for HSUS, which means she worked for advocacy and state legislation with regards to animals. She has an interest in social justice and a desire for equity, so she leads initiatives that increase access to critical pet wellness care services and information for people and pets that live in underserved communities. She's also the founder and executive director of Beyond Fences, which is an organization based in Durham, North Carolina, that has worked for 10 years to provide free spay-neuter, fences, pet supplies, and medical care for people and their pets. And she's brought one of her colleagues from Beyond Fences with her today, so it's been a pleasure to learn a lot more about their work and their organization as well. I want to thank the Lawrence Fund for their support and the ASPCA Community Medicine team for coming from New York City and helping support the program as well.
I'm going to use this microphone. Does that sound okay to everybody? All right. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. She hasn't said those nice things to me until I'm in front of y'all where I just might get a tear in my eye. And the folks that I am here with today, they are going to be my heckling crew, I'm afraid. They'll tell me if I'm messing up or forgetting to mention anything. Okay, so I want everybody to be honest to start with. How many of you came today just for the pizza? Nobody? Okay, there's somebody that's honest. Thank you. I knew there has to be at least a couple of people who came just for the pizza. Thank you all for being here today and taking some time out to hear me speak and to hear about the work that we are doing in the Pets for Life program. So I want to tell you a little bit about Pets for Life to begin with. So as Dr. McCobb said, we're a program of the Humane Society of the United States, and we are focused on increasing access for people and pets living in underserved areas to services, resources, and information for pet care. And we do this in a few different ways. So one, we actually have direct care programs. So we have our staff, our teams that are out in the community, on the ground, meeting people in underserved areas and providing free spay-neuter, free medical care, supplies, a variety of services. And then we provide mentorship and training to local organizations to do this work, to incorporate community outreach and pet owner support programming into their organizational missions. And we do that by facilitating grants, providing financial support, and also just guidance and the how-to deliver this type of care. And then sort of more broadly, we work on within our industry having policy and enforcement reform around a lot of historical processes and policies that have not always been fair and equitable to communities in poverty or communities of color. And I want to show you just a map of where we are to give you an idea. So this is where our program operates across the country. As you can tell, there's obvious geographic diversity. We really wanted to show that no matter if you're in the Pacific Northwest or you're in the Deep South or in the Midwest, that there's not only a need for this type of program, but that it works everywhere, that whenever you are approaching communities, really considering their perspective and making a human connection, that's something that applies no matter where you live in the community that you're serving. And we also have a variety of groups that are doing the work. So we have all the way from open admission shelters, municipal agencies, to limited admission shelters. Some groups are doing this work who are not shelters at all. They are spay-neuter clinics or rescue groups. So we have all types of organizations that are doing this work to show that no matter what size you are and what your focus is, that this can be something that you deliver and bring to your community. And doing it in different types of communities as well. So we're in some urban centers like the west side of Chicago or East LA. And then we are in very rural markets in Idaho. We're in a county that only has about 500 people. We are operating now on native land, on Blackfeet Nation in Montana, and just recently started working in Alaskan bush villages in the YK Delta region of Alaska. So again, just showing that no matter what a community looks like, there is a need for pet owner support, and that the approach of Pets for Life of really connecting with people applies wherever you are. And I should also mention, we're gonna have some time at the end for questions, so if you guys have thoughts or there's something that I don't cover as much as you would like, or you have more questions, we'll have some time at the end for that. And so just a little snapshot of what we've done with PFL to date. So of all of those communities that were on that map, we've served over 130,000 pets total. And that's really just since 2012 when we got started in earnest. And then of those pets served, we provided 85,000 free spay-neuter surgeries. But the program is much more comprehensive. It's not just a spay-neuter program. So we provide comprehensive medical care and support to people. And so all of the services and supplies that we provided, over 325,000. And that ranges from everything that you can imagine, from flea and tick medication, dewormer, something as simple as a leash or a collar, a litter box, and then also a variety of other things that I'll talk about a little bit, and helping people with landlord issues, or whenever their pet is seized by a shelter and can't afford to be reunited with that pet. And all of this really works together for what it is that we're hoping to accomplish is to ensure access for all pet owners to services for their pets, so that no matter who you are, where you live, what your background, what your income, everyone has equal opportunity to provide the care that they want and need for their pet. And so I want to kind of start with a conversation of what underserved means, because that is our focus in Pets for Life, is working to reach and to connect with people and pets in underserved communities. But if we don't know what that means, it's sort of hard to do. So that's where we start, is really talking about what underserved looks like and what it means. And that can be sometimes uncomfortable. It's important to have conversations that maybe aren't the most fun topics to discuss, or that we always feel at ease in having those conversations. And so to start with what poverty is, how it's defined in a way that is recognized in the United States. Does anybody know what the poverty rate is set at in the US? Anyone? You don't have to be shy. No? So in the United States, $23,000 is the poverty rate for a family of 4. And that's no matter where you live. That is set across the country. So you can live in New York City, you can live in Des Moines, Iowa. That's the federal poverty rate. And so it's pretty easy to understand just with that figure what that means for someone as far as what they bring home in a weekly paycheck, what they have monthly to cover utilities, rent, food, transportation, childcare, and how that can make life really difficult whenever you have a pet. And even low cost or services with copays might be tough for people that are in this pet owning audience. And so within that poverty, there is a nuance between systemic poverty and conditional poverty. How many students are here? If you're a student, raise your hand. You're all probably in conditional poverty right now as students. We've all been there at some point where you don't have an income or you have a very limited income, but you haven't always lived in poverty, and you have hope at least that you're going to get out of poverty at some point. And so that's conditional poverty, and that really sort of runs the gamut and isn't always sort of, specific to a community, and definitely not to people across their lifetime. Where systemic poverty are people who are born into poverty, their parents lived in poverty, their children are going to live in poverty, and the world that they exist in is surrounded by poverty. And that matters because when you are in systemic poverty, there are all sorts of things that go along with that. And that's a lot of what I want to talk about today. Not so much how we do our work. If we have time, I can get into that. But why the work is needed, and really understanding just how much exists in the community that we're not currently addressing. And I think a lot of it is because we don't understand it. And so when you're thinking about the systemic poverty, there really are institutional biases that exist that have created a lot of what we see today. And if you have any interest, I encourage you to do more reading and studying about things that have happened over the last few decades that result in what most of our towns and cities are set up as and what they look like. Things like restricted covenants that set parameters on where people could purchase homes if they were a person of color. Redlining that really grouped people together and kept them away from other segments of the population. So there's a lot of segregation that still exists today that we might not recognize it or call it by that name, and it's not by accident that it exists and that it's there. And an issue that I really didn't know a lot about before starting this work about 10 years ago, and still have a lot to learn, but I've really learned a lot of how it impacts poor communities, and specifically poor communities of color, is our criminal justice system with mass incarceration. And there are some stats that I think are pretty staggering that I have, because I wanted to make sure I shared them correctly with you guys. And they may seem like they're not true, but the Department of Justice produced these numbers that at any given time in the jail system in the United States, 60 to 70% of inmates are not convicted. So that's in all of our jail systems, that they are in jail, they are incarcerated because they cannot afford bail. And so they have never been convicted of whatever the crime is that they're accused of. They are legally innocent, but they are sitting in jail. And why this matters to all of us in this room is because of what it does both to individuals and to communities collectively that then really have an impact on how people are living with their pets and what they're able to access and afford for their pets. And the end result of that is probably even more disturbing, in that people who are able to bond out of jail, 88% of those people, their result is that they're not convicted. There are people who are not able to bond out, only about 35% of them result in not being convicted. So the vast majority are convicted. And so these things really do impact communities where people's lives are extremely destabilized. They lose jobs. They're already living paycheck to paycheck. They are displaced from their homes. They no longer qualify for government support like housing. It tears families apart. And if you do any type of community outreach in an area that has high rates of poverty, it will take you probably less than a day to encounter someone who's been impacted by this issue. It just is so prevalent in such an unfortunate way. And that's why it's important for us to understand things that we see, and the results of all of these issues really do matter and are so important for us to understand, and how we really inform our work and the way that we interact and the way that we perceive communities that need subsidized services and support. And then, not to be political at all, but immigration, although it is a hot political topic right now, also has a major impact on communities, where, again, people are just uncertain of their future. People are separated from loved ones and family members, and that it can create just a lot of distrust in receiving services and wanting to interact with service providers in a way where you feel confident and comfortable that there's not going to be a negative impact to your life. And then on top of just people in communities people living in poverty or communities with high rates of poverty, there's this whole segment of the population that hovers just above that. So that federal poverty line just captures people at a certain income and below. But there are people who are just a couple of $1,000s over that line, or even maybe $10,000, $20,000 over that line, but still really struggle financially. And so the Federal Reserve actually has started doing a study on economic well-being, and they've done it twice now. And I think that it had some pretty upsetting, not surprising statistics. And so this is a survey that was conducted across all economic segments. So it wasn't just people living in poverty. And of all of the folks who engaged in this nationwide survey, almost half of them could not afford any sort of emergency over $400. And that's for themselves. So that's for them or their family, that if something came up that cost over $400, they did not have the money to cover that. And so if you peel back the layers, if people are not able to do that for themselves or their family, then their dog or cat, imagine if it gets sick or has some sort of medical issue. Or really, even in some communities, spay-neuters can be a few $100s, and just how inaccessible that is. And then one more stat, that about 30% of people had gone without medical care for themselves in the last 12 months because of the cost just being too prohibitive. And so again, if that is the case for people, then imagine what that means for their pets and how that really is just out of reach for so many people. And so this is an example of what we collect and put together whenever we start in a new community. We conduct an assessment, not only looking at where poverty is concentrated, things like racial segregation, but also where are resources currently. So where are their veterinary offices? Where are their big box retailers and pet supply stores? And so this is an example in Atlanta. And this is what we find in community after community after community, is that there are these service deserts for animal services, very similar to food deserts, and they almost always overlap. And so in this pink highlighted area, the average income is about $25,000, the average household income, and about 40% of people that live in that area live below the poverty rate. And so you can see that there are not services within that area. So if you're a pet owner that lives in there, and if a veterinarian is 10 miles away, it might as well be 100 miles away, because you're probably not aware of those services. You're not being positively messaged to or engaged on the services. If you did know about a service, you probably could not afford it, and you might not be able to get there. And so this is what has been created by a lot of these issues that we're talking about, are these deserts for pet services. And so that map that I showed you guys, all of those markets that Pets for Life is operating in, we collect the exact same data in all of those communities. So we can really have now this nice snapshot of what it means to be a pet owner in an underserved community in the United States. And so out of those 130,000 pets served, when we met them, 88% of them were unaltered. I don't know if that surprises anyone or if that's something that you would expect, but when you compare it to the national average, it's pretty astounding. So the last APPA study that was conducted, close to 90% of owned dogs and cats are spay or neutered in the US now. So it's the exact opposite in underserved areas, which really shows us that there's just a great need for our time, energy, and resources to be focused on underserved areas. And we also found in these communities that almost 70% of the dogs and cats have never seen a veterinarian, ever. So for no preventative care, no wellness care, they don't have a relationship with a veterinarian. And the majority of those that had seen a veterinarian, it was almost always for emergency services. So it's when something had gotten to an urgent state or in some form of crisis care. And a statistic that I think is really important for us as the holders of information and the service providers to know is that 84% of pet owners in underserved areas had never reached out to their local shelter or animal control agency. And so that tells us a couple of things. That one, what we've been doing traditionally is not reaching this audience. It's just not working. And so we need to look at how we are providing services and how we are engaging communities. But it also tells us that there's a lot of distrust that needs to be solved, that we need to work on building trust with communities and getting past some of the negative experiences that people have had, whether it's punitive or they have reached out for a service and just not been able to afford it and then were made to feel bad about that. But there's this huge disconnect that exists that we have the opportunity and the power to overcome. And then one final stat from our communities that we work in is where people get their pets. And I think this just sort of further shows and solidifies just how there really is this great divide. If you add up just the top few, you'll see that the vast majority of pets, people get them from within their own community. The majority of them are just from, a neighbor who moved and can't keep their dog, or maybe someone passed away and the cat that they were feeding, someone takes in. So they just really are being good neighbors and good friends and taking care of animals whenever they're in need. And so there's very, very small percentage that's actually from within the system that most of us operate in. Yes, so at any given time, the number, about 60 to 70% of inmates have not been convicted, that they are sitting in jail because they cannot post bail. Okay, so when we talk about lack of access, I think it's another issue of importance to really sort of flesh that out and what exactly does that mean. Most of us would say financial right off the top, that is a huge barrier to people receiving services or even looking for services for their pets is financial. And that is extremely important. Cost of care is a major challenge for a lot of people, but it's not just about money. There are all of these other areas that are, for us as a service provider, again, important for us to know and to think about. So geography is one. So that pet service desert that I showed you, even if someone could come up with money, whenever you don't live close to a veterinary office or you don't have personal transportation, or maybe the personal transportation you have is not reliable, and every other time you go to get in your car, it doesn't start, or maybe at the end of the month, you don't have gas money to put into the car. And so geography and transportation can be major, major barriers for people, even if you can get past the financial piece. And then time for people. This is something that was a really big lesson for us when we started the program, is understanding people and their schedules and how most spay-neuter clinics and private practice veterinarians are open during the workday. So their hours are 8 to 5 or 8 to 6. And so someone who has a job, and a lot of times in underserved areas, they don't have the flexibility to call in late and say, I need to drop my dog off at the vet, can I come in 30 minutes or an hour late? Or to take off early to go pick up their pet. And I don't know if this applies to any of you guys or what you have participated in, but I've worked with quite a few veterinary offices that are like, if you're not here at this time, we are locking the door. Like, they don't want to stay, a minute past. And that can be really, really difficult for a lot of people to adhere to. And then just times to ask questions that people, a lot of times when they've never had a service before, maybe they've never had a pet that has been altered, they have concerns. They need to get to a place of feeling comfortable. And so if they're at work all day, when are they going to be able to ask those questions and engage with somebody? So time is a really important part of understanding what is limited in access so often. And then a biggie is engagement. It's how we are connecting with people, how we're treating people, what our level of customer service is. So again, if someone has never had a pet spayed or neutered before, it is understandable that they might be nervous in having that surgery done. And so it might seem like a really big deal. But for us, if we do spay and neuter every single day, it's just a simple procedure. And so if we are projecting, in a way that just get over it, don't worry about it, that could be discouraging to someone, that they really need to talk it through. They really need to understand what it means. And so the way that we engage with people and the way that we talk with folks can make a big difference in what level of access they have to those services. And that really goes along with building trust with folks and in sharing information. A lot of times people really just need to have a little time to absorb what it is that you have to share, and to be able to think about it, not feel pressured, and say, okay, this is the decision that I want to make for my pet. And so lack of access really goes so far beyond just money, and in ways that's good, because it's not just about cost, that there are things that we can do to improve access for people that don't have a price tag. And then just to mention a little bit, and I'll go through this pretty quickly because we don't have a lot of time today, but there are a lot of needs in communities that have nothing to do with veterinary care or medical care. And so it might not apply to everybody in this room, but even if it's not something you would be working directly on, I think it is still a good thing to have an awareness of, and to recognize whenever you are working with communities that are underserved, is that housing is such a major issue. I don't know exactly the landscape here, but in most of the communities that we work across the country, affordable housing is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, that it is almost at epidemic levels in so many communities. And so that creates a lot of struggle for people, not only in having some sort of consistency in their life, but if you are providing transportation, it might take 3 or 4 times to pick up a cat because someone is at different homes, or they're in between homes and they're staying with friends. And so it really does have a direct correlation to the work that you're doing. And then RTOs, return to owners. Everybody know what that is? Whenever a dog or cat, or it could be another animal, ends up at the shelter, in the shelter system, for whatever reason, they're picked up loose, or someone maybe found an animal and they took them to the shelter, that there are almost always fees associated for someone to get their pet back, reclaim fees. And that varies from city to city and state to state, where there's almost always a cost for that. And so a lot of animals that are in the shelter and labeled as homeless are not actually homeless. They have homes, they just don't always have homes that can afford to be reunited with them. And so it's another where we sort of have created this myth of sorts that if an animal ends up in a shelter, it must mean that people don't care, or that people aren't responsible, or that people don't want their pet back. And we have found over and over and over again that that's absolutely not true, that there is a fear of getting into trouble for a lot of people and going in and reclaiming a pet, but one of the biggest barriers is the cost. And then again, just things that I say simple because it would be simple to us, but it's not always simple to the people that we serve, are just supplies, that someone would have the ability to receive a leash or a collar so they can safely take their dog for a walk around their neighborhood, or they can do it in a way that they're not carrying a big heavy chain. And so it's enjoyable in a way that they can bond and get exercise for their pet. Or they really want to transition a cat indoors, but they rent and they're terrified that the cat's going to tear up their blinds or the carpet, and then they're not going to be able to afford the repairs, so they're going to get evicted. And so things that really can be very, very small and easy can make a huge difference for people. And so this is really a lot of what I wanted to focus on. And so I wasn't sure how fast I'd move through some of these things to get to it, because I think that it applies to you guys and being here, that it's such an important conversation. And this might be even more uncomfortable than some of the other things that I talked about. But I'm guessing that most of you have either been involved at some point or been privy to conversation within the veterinary community about subsidized services, about nonprofits providing care and just what the role is for that, and even how it applies to private practice veterinarians. And so we don't have an answer. I don't think that there's a consensus in the veterinary community. You know, we work across the country and have a lot of vets that we are lucky enough to have partnerships with. And there's a variety of opinions between all those veterinarians of what they are comfortable with, what their opinion is. And so I don't think that there is a solution to a lot of these issues yet. But that's why it's so important for us to talk about them and to have conversations around it and to try to do it in a constructive way. And that's not always sort of loaded with emotion or with, you know, sort of a personal bias. And so one of the things that comes up really frequently for us, and if it doesn't come up here, then you guys are lucky, but I think that it has, is just what the role is for subsidized care and nonprofit providers. And what we believe in Pets for Life is that those types of services are a complement and not competition to private practice, and that there's even a role for private practice in providing affordable care. And really, it's just a matter of numbers. Like, if you really just look at it on paper, I think that it makes a lot of sense. When you have more than 50 million people in the US, about 1 in 6 people live below the poverty line, you can pretty reasonably deduct that those are not current clients at a full-service private practice. They're not people who are able to have that relationship with a veterinarian. And then for even people who are not living below poverty, with over half of the households in the country having an income of less than $60,000, that's an even bigger piece of the pie of the pet-owning population that probably are not able to afford a lot of veterinary care and its current cost. And then something that I do know has come up in the state of Massachusetts is about subsidized care being substandard. That if there is a nonprofit clinic or a program that subsidizes cost, that, you know, maybe people do believe it, or it might just be some fear mongering that happens that, oh, well, that place over there doesn't use anesthesia, you can't trust them. Or this place, you know, over here, their level of care is just not what it should be. And I see a couple of people who are sort of nodding to that sort of are aware that, you know, this is something that, whether right or wrong, that it exists, and we really have to, I think, get honest with ourselves and with each other and in our field to say, like, what is our role in making things more equitable and in being fair and just. And that there probably is a place for all of these different types of services. And then a biggie, which I think is one of the toughest topics to talk about and to sort of come to some sort of plan around, is the standard of care or the minimal level of care. So if you have a client who is not going to be able to afford really expensive diagnostics, what does that mean? Does that mean that they don't receive anything? Or are there things that can be explored and tried that would be in the price range? And again, I don't have an answer to that, but, you know, we work with a lot of different veterinarians that come to a place where they're comfortable in saying, okay, I can treat this ear infection without maybe doing what I, you know, would in another case where I do a heartworm test and I do, you know, a fecal and, you know, all of those sorts of things that we can just address what the most pertinent issue is and make that pet healthier and happier. And so again, you know, there's a lot of emotion and for good reason around some of these issues, but it's really something for all of us, I think, to tackle head on and to really find ways that we can have some sort of dialogue about what it means for us as service providers and what the need is in the communities that we serve, especially if we want to serve them comprehensively. Okay, so just a little bit about 5 more minutes, you think, and then take questions? Okay. So just a little bit about the PFL approach. I'll go through this really quickly, but I think that while it is specific to the PFL program, it applies across the board, is really focusing on customer service, on understanding people that you're serving, and on building trust. Like, that's the foundation of everything. And I think no matter who you are and what your role is in this industry, that we can all improve on those items, and especially whenever we are wanting to reach a segment of the population that hasn't traditionally been served, or been served in a way that was really meaningful. And what comes along with that is being able to remove judgment. And I think that that's something that's really tough. Just by human nature, we all have preconceived notions about others. You know, it's the whole idea of first impressions. Like, we make decisions on what we think about someone either before we meet them or right when we meet them. And so it's okay to acknowledge that we do that, but then to not let those prejudices impact the way we treat people or the services that we provide. And so I think it would be irresponsible to say, well, we just should have no judgment, because I think that it's a very natural thing for us to do it. But then to really think about what that means, and then to hopefully inform ourselves as to why maybe those judgments aren't true, and why they've been damaging, and why it keeps us from interacting with or having relationships with certain people. And then finally, how we talk about this type of work. With this sort of being part of the shelter medicine program, it's very easy to look at, well, if you are providing free spay neuter for a certain community, or you're extending medical care, what does that mean for shelter intake? That has been really just sort of the gold standard for a long time within companion animal welfare, at least, is that everything circulates around and has to have some sort of connection to shelter intake. And what we are proposing with Pets for Life is that, yes, reducing shelter intake is extremely important. We're all behind that, and we're doing what we can. But that there is a value just in increasing access, that it doesn't have to have any sort of correlation, any sort of impact on shelter intake for it to be valuable and for it to make a difference in people and pets' lives. And so this last slide, this is specific to spay neuter. And I think that it's a really important stat, not just on spay neuter, but it dispels some long held assumptions in animal welfare. So this is our conversion rate over the last few years, which means of the unaltered pets that we have met, what percentage of them were then spayed or neutered through the program. And so you can see it has increased every year. And these are in communities that we have consistently been in, with now almost 90% of the unaltered pets being spayed or neutered through the program. And so that's great in and of itself. We're always happy to have more altered pets in the community. But what we're really happy about is that what I have heard, as long as I've been involved in animal welfare, is that there are certain people, certain communities that are opposed to spay neuter, that are not going to be interested in spay neuter. And it's absolutely not true. And now we have the data to prove it, that when people are provided the opportunity, when they are given access and barriers are removed, everyone makes the exact same decisions about their pets. But that's a lot of responsibility on us of how are we going to provide that access, all of those things that really come into play when you're talking about access. How are we going to make it affordable? How are we going to make it geographically reachable? How are we going to engage with people in a positive and consistent way, where over time people are feeling really good about and comfortable in making these decisions? And so I think that this stat is always, it's such a strong one to share, because it really sort of turns on its head things that we have thought in animal welfare for a long time, and how we have labeled those around us, and how we've used that almost as a reason to sort of live in a bubble, or to say, we were just talking about it this morning, and usually I sort of ask this question and make people admit this honesty too, of how many people got into veterinary care or animal services because you don't like people. Y'all, if you don't have to admit it, but if you haven't said it, you've probably thought it at some point. And that is a really, really dangerous way to think, especially if you're focused on companion animals, because they are companions to people, and we have to build relationships with people if we want to reach those animals. Okay, and I will stop there so we have some time for questions, because I think we have to leave this room by 10 till, so. Yes. Did y'all hear that? If you want cheese pizza, get it now. Repeat it. Sure. Okay. Okay, we'll start with the question online while everyone's getting some cheese pizza, and then we can have some in the room. So the question is, what services do we provide for people who are in situations of eviction and domestic violence? Is that correct? It is one of the toughest issues, eviction is, because most often when someone is evicted, it's not like there are 10 other options of housing for them to go to. And there are some shelters now that if someone is evicted, they can go into a shelter, and the shelter will provide 2 weeks of keeping their animal while they're looking for another place to live. And I think that that's wonderful. For Pets for Life, we don't operate shelters, so we don't have that space there. And so we really are just working with people on resources, on identifying resources, connecting them with other groups that we have become familiar with, and just trying our best to work with them and be a support. And that isn't always something that results in a success, but we found that even if you don't have maybe a tangible service to offer, just letting people know that you're there, that you care, that you will listen, can make a difference too. But really, it's just trying to find resources. But the sad truth is that there really aren't enough resources available for people. That the reason communities remain underserved is because there aren't enough services. And I think the same thing with domestic violence. I think there's been a little bit more growth in that arena for shelters to accept pets along with people, because there have been studies that have shown that people will stay in abusive situations because they're scared for their pet. And so I think that we are seeing more and more of that. It's not to the level that it should be. But that's really the best solution, I think, for domestic violence, is for human shelters to start accepting animals. That's something that we could improve on greatly and immediately. Yes. Yeah. What is your name? I love you, because this is something we were all talking about as a group, and we actually, it's a very common topic for us, is end-of-life decision-making and providing that service. Euthanasia is one of the most important services that we provide. If I had to cut things in my budget, that would be last on the list to cut. I think it is just one of the most vital, just sort of giving people dignity in making that decision, and talk about something that people have not had access to before. In underserved areas, when you don't have a veterinary relationship, whenever your pet does get sick or there is a life-threatening illness or injury, that's just never been an option. And so we work with just a variety of veterinarians wherever we can. And that looks different in every market, especially when we start in a community. We might have 0 partners that are able to do that, but that's something that is like at the top of our list for us to find partners that will do that. And usually that will give us some sort of price break. We never ask for it for free. But maybe if it's normally $200, could, they do it for us for $100, because we're probably going to bring them a lot of those cases. And so we just work on finding partners and negotiating prices to be able to provide that to our clients, because it's an extremely important service. Yeah, that's what we've seen the same studies, like we've looked into that, but That and really being in the community as much as you can. There's just nothing that replaces that presence. And that doesn't mean that you have to go to door. We know that not everyone has that interest or that capability, but just finding ways that you can have the human interaction with people is really where you're going to find the best results. Even if it seems like it's maybe labor intensive at the beginning, once you build a reputation in the community, it then sort of like builds on itself. Word of mouth is huge. And so if you can just invest up front in some sort of community presence, you don't even have to worry about those things. You really don't. We get asked all the time, well, what if people don't open their doors? And it's really the wrong question, because it's what if everybody opens their door? And that's what we see, is that once people become familiar with us as a program, or whatever service it is that we're providing, all of those things that you sort of are working to figure out, and like, well, what is the open rate in these emails, or how can I post it on social media, if people are on smartphones, you just don't need that as much. You really don't. So I'm always encouraging people, find a way, even if it's 1 hour a week. Most of us can probably figure that out in some way, and what our business is, or what our organization, to be in the community in some way. Because if you are, it's more than what's there right now. Yeah, that we have. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm supposed to repeat the question. Are we involved in communities and serving areas that are not always English speakers? And so we have a lot of communities where we have to translate material, or we try to have staff that is bilingual in whatever the language is. We had one community where there was a large refugee population, and our instructions for transport and post-op, we had to translate to like 11 different languages. Like, that was the most that we ever had. The majority of time, it's Spanish, that's what we're having to make sure we have information that can be communicated in a way. But I think it's really important to find ways to do that, but don't let it limit you. So even if you don't have someone on staff, maybe if you are serving a large Latino population, don't be afraid to get started if you don't have someone, that is able to speak Spanish at first, that there are ways around it. And again, just being there, people will appreciate, even if you're not able to fully communicate like you would prefer.
I want to make sure we have time to clear the room, so let's thank her, and we'll go out in the lobby if people have questions.